Hello, good afternoon. Slightly different topic from the medical panel that was here. We have an equally exciting panel in a different way, and we're going to talk about investments, in the cannabis space. What does it look like? Where does it come from? Success factors, pitfalls, challenges, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do, we'll cover off a brief bio with Geoff, with Nick, with Zavio, and with Jonathan. I'll hand over to those guys to talk about any particular fun, exciting, challenging, awful topics in terms of barriers to access and so on and so forth. And then I will hand over to you guys for a Q&A session. Please do ask some questions, do challenge. As we saw from the last session, I don't think there was any element that was not off topic or that was a taboo. So without further ado, I will introduce Geoff. Geoff has spent 20 years in the UK financial services industry as an analyst, as a fund manager, focused within the financial sector. As an analyst, he led a #1 rated UK small and mid-cap financials team, working in Moscow, Singapore, before moving to Germany, where he built GLI Finance into a leading investor in the alternative finance sector. Having delivered shareholders a 15-fold return, so we think he knows what he's talking about. He left at the end of 2015 and founded Afaafa. Is that pronounced correctly? Or Afaafa? His own investment and advisory business, acting as a director, advisor, and mentor. In 2018, he began to focus on the challenge of financing the cannabis sector and founded CannaFi Group. Handing over to Nick. Nick is the finance director of Zoetic, a vertically integrated CBD company with growing operations in Colorado, which retails its products in both the USA and the UK. That sounds like a fun thing to talk about, so we'll probe around that a little later on. Prior to joining Zoetic, Nick worked as a corporate finance advisor, assisting companies in the UK capital markets for 20 years. He's worked at several of the well-known investment banks and stockbrokers, including Cazenove and Cantor Fitzgerald. Zavio is a private equity consultant working for Eco Equity, a UK-registered company that has its operations in Africa. A keen watcher of the markets, Zavio has been studying the European cannabis market in particular for nearly 2 years, with 6 years' experience in the bond markets, and has an extensive knowledge on fixed income, such as litigation funding, ISAs, property, and energy. Jonathan, finally, is the director of the Cannabis Investor Forum, an event focused bringing together the UK cannabis investment community this October in London. I've actually attended one of these events, and they are super cool, super fun, very informative, and there's lots of takeaways that, from a practical point of view, that people are gaining lots of value with. Jonathan has spent a decade in the investment industry and has broad experience of markets and growth companies. In 2015, he transitioned from the front lines of financial markets to establish the UK Investor magazine, a leading UK investment publication. So I'm going to hand over to the panel, and we'll certainly, let's start off with Nick, and let's kick off with you in terms of what are the most common questions, advice points, mentoring things that people come to you in terms of your advice, and what does that look like?
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Nick Tulloch. I run a business called Zoetic International, which is listed on the London Stock Exchange. We are the only vertically integrated stock exchange listed company operating in the CBD and hemp industry. Now what I mean by that is that we grow our own product both in Colorado, indoors and outdoors, and then we retail the refined products here in the UK and also in the US. I spend quite a lot of my week talking to investors. We have over 4,000 shareholders in the company in total. We've been listed for 4.5 years, but only got into the hemp and CBD business earlier this year. The single most common question is, how are we going to make money? How are we going to sell the products in enough volume and enough margin? And generally the answer to that is we say two things. We need to be at both ends, or that we need to focus on both ends of the vertically integrated spectrum. So we need to get our branding right. We need to have a good quality product that has a good brand that appeals to people. And at the start of the process, we need to get our seeds right. Probably many of you know that hemp is a crop that grows in male and female varieties. It's only the female variety that produces any meaningful yield. We have an indoor facility in Colorado where we're able to produce purely feminized seeds, which we sell wholesale. And that is the single highest margin part of the business that we currently run. Now, we grow hemp outdoors, we manufacture, we produce our own products, but we increasingly see that middle ground of being vertically integrated as lower margin. It's certainly profitable, but the high margin is getting the seeds right and getting the branding right. And that tends to be our standard pitch when we talk to investors and talk to our shareholders about the importance of being able to make money, and from an investor point of view, it's all about making money. This is a very high growth industry. I mean, I've got to go back several years before I can think of another industry I worked in that had quite the same level of growth. But actually being part of the aspects of that industry that are highest margin, that's where we really focus our efforts.
Hi, I'm Geoff Miller. As was said, my business, CannaFi, lends money to the industry as opposed to providing equity capital. And the reason that we went down that route was one of the questions we struggle with is to justify an awful lot of the very high valuations that people will put on some very early stage businesses to try and get equity investment, where most of the money that's being raised is going into fixed assets, and these businesses are going to be very cash generative, and therefore debt seemed a better solution to us. So I think I would say investors are often querying whether or not they can justify the valuation that's being put on some businesses. As an ex-analyst, I would always say be very cynical about the projections that people are putting into the future and actually focus on what companies are realistically going to make in terms of actual profit when you're looking to invest into a business. And if you can get yourself comfortable, then that's great. If it's based on some fairly heroic assumptions that these businesses are going to be somehow better than every other business in the industry when there is so much competition, then you might struggle to make a decent return.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zavio. I work for Eco Equity. We are a cannabis cultivator based out of Africa in Zimbabwe. We mainly focus on the pharmaceutical grade cannabis. And we mainly focus on the European market rather than the UK. I think a lot of legislation in place here in the UK in order to actually provide pharmaceutical cannabis so far, but we have various contacts here in the UK that will soon come to fruition, looking at the market. But I think my main role is to educate. And, you know, like you said, the returns, when you look at investing into the cannabis sector, returns is obviously what people are after out of an investment. And I think, luckily, you know, being based in a place like Africa, it's an extremely low-cost region. So we are able to, we're able to, you know, come to some very high returns, as well as stay within the legislation here in Europe and in the UK, which is important when you're looking to invest overseas, to ensure you're compliant here in the UK with the Proceeds of Crime Act. Mainly that's what we look at doing. We also look to produce our products to a very, very strict and high standard of GMP. GMP standards are extremely important, especially when you're providing a pharmaceutical grade product, and mainly what we're focusing on at the moment is producing the highest grade products we possibly can and becoming extremely well known in the industry for that very reason.
Hello, my name's Jonathan. I'm from the UK Investor Magazine. So we started off with the Cannabis Investor Forum at the end of last year, putting it together, and that was very much in a reaction to a lot of questions we were getting from our readers into the sector, that, as you all know, in the UK, in terms of listed opportunities for anybody buying stocks on an exchange, the actual shares available are pretty limited at this point in time. Of course, there was some exposure to the Canadian markets that some of the investors were taking, but we obviously found that those people that were investing there were seeing quite high valuations, something that Geoff touched on there. So we're really putting together an event that's going to be focused on the UK industry for those companies that are operating within the UK and possibly going to be looking at a listing at some point within the next sort of 18 months or so. I spend a lot of time going on road shows for various different companies that are planning to list here in London, and it is very much a situation that I think we're going to see some floodgates opening soon. I don't think anybody really wants to be the first. There's a lot of people trying to be the first, but that's going to really attract a high cost to actually get themselves onto the main market of the London Stock Exchange. But speaking to people out there and seeing the companies there, I think when you get the first main market listing come through, I think you're probably going to see sort of 10 to 15 within the space of 2 years, and that will probably open up the doors to a recognised cannabis sector within the exchanges, and that will really attract overseas investments.
Okay, we'll come back to the investment points in a moment. Does anyone have any questions at this point they'd like to ask before I get started? Can I just borrow one of that? There you go, sir.
Yeah, I've got a question for Jonathan, just picking up on what you said there. Frankfurt seems to be quite a popular place for cannabis businesses to list. Is not a case that the UK is seen as unstable and uncertain. Then you've got issues over the Proceeds of Crime Act, which seems to be dampening down expectations and people's optimism towards the UK.
Yes, so if you're looking at Europe, there are and there have been a lot more listings so far, but what we're finding is particularly those companies that are operating predominantly in the UK do want to get that London listing because there is, more liquidity within that London market than you're seeing in Frankfurt. So where, yes, there is the issue of the proceeds of crime, I think there is a process that a lot of these companies are going through with their lawyers, and once that's ironed out to some extent and there's some changes and some clear guidance, I think then people will look at London as the European base for raising capital.
Anyone like to add to that?
Just a couple of things to add to Jonathan's point. We are listed already, and I talk to the stock exchange and also the regulators on a very regular basis about our own position. We would be absolutely delighted to see more companies come onto the London market. Just as Jonathan says, it validates the sector, and I think the volume of companies coming through would bring more investors, and that will benefit all of us. Where the stock exchange and the regulators are is, I think they're quite nervous that they want to ensure that the next group of companies that come through are very high quality, and the words they use to me is they want to see companies of institutional quality, and there are several around. But given this is a new sector, there's a little bit of confusion around some of the regulatory aspects. Different companies are coming at it from different points of view. Some are cannabis, some are hemp. They're providing different products and different services. I think there's a concern of the regulators that next group, the next 2 or 3 companies, are of the highest possible quality. I mean, put short, they don't want any scandals. And I suspect what we'll find, just as Jonathan pointed out, is once we get the next 2 or 3, we'll see a large number of them. And I'm aware of several companies that are currently in the process of applying for a listing. We actually advise the stock exchange to a certain extent on some of the questions they might ask, some of the things they might look for. As I say, it's very much in our interest to see more companies come onto the London market.
I think it's important to understand that the UK Listing Authority and the AIM team both would like to see more cannabis companies that are listed, and they both expressed that. Where the difficulty comes is from a high level, strategically they can see that that's the way they want to go, but as Nick says, there are some technical challenges in getting there because they don't want to screw up. But I think if you look a year down the line, we will have gone through this process. As Jonathan said, it may well be that the first person that's across the line is going to be paying a lot more than subsequent people, but I'm sure that we'll get there. And just as we've seen in a number of other sectors, the fact that there may be more listings on other exchanges in Europe at the moment, the fact that, as Jonathan said, there is significantly greater liquidity available for small and mid-cap stocks in London, it's likely that this will be the place that they list in time.
Okay. Anyone else have a question? I'd like to ask one, please, if it's okay. Just broadening the investment topic or the point, I've spent the last 5, 6, 7 years working within the FMCG sector, and more specifically within beverage. Someone like a Constellation Brands, they invest in CGC, Molson Coors, December in Canada, the first product comes out. Is there a huge differentiation in terms of the investigations, the inquiries that you guys are experiencing? Are they looking to invest in a big corporate like a Constellation? They see the share price, something's coming out, or is it a case that the topical pieces are around the LSE, the AIM, or in Frankfurt?
I think a bit of both, really. We're a relatively small company, and we get a number of inquiries from prospective shareholders interested in the high growth and maybe the exciting investment opportunity we can offer. But we're also quite careful to play at being very, very conservative. I'm always saying to investors and shareholders, we are ultra cautious. If we think any rule is even slightly grey, we're not going to go there. So, for example, when we sell in the US, there are 4 states that are just slightly different in their approach to the sale of CBD products. We just exclude them. I think if we tried, we could probably get around, or we could probably comply with rules. But the style we have is just don't take any risks. And I think in this new industry, in this slightly uncertain industry, I think that's very important. Now, there's always going to be comfort for investors to be looking at a larger company that has got more products, more sales, more opportunities. But smaller companies like us can mimic that by being very conservative and very responsibly run, and making sure that we don't take unnecessary risks with investors' money. And as I said at the start, that's really what it comes down to. It's about making money for investors and demonstrating that we've got the risks under control and we can manage the upside accordingly.
Anything else to add, Zavio?
Nope. Touching on what you were saying regarding risk, I think there's a number of different angles you need to look at when looking into the space. But I think risk is something that's very loosely sort of seen as. It depends what you consider a risk, and I think a lot of companies, if you can mitigate those risks, it should still definitely be worth something looking into, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think touching on that point there in terms of what investors are looking for, this is obviously a very early stage industry, so people looking at this sector would naturally be leaning towards early stage companies that are establishing themselves here in the UK, Europe and the United States, with the view that maybe 3 to 5 years down the line, that those companies then actually become potential targets for the likes of Constellation Brands.
In terms of the type of investors that there are at the moment, there are very few large family offices, so running high net worth, ultra high net worth money, very few of them that I now speak to that don't already have 1 or 2 investments that they've already made in the sector. What they're doing is they're putting money into businesses that they're creating themselves, that they're planning to effectively try and persuade other people to take off their hands for a much higher price in the future. I think there are a lot of institutions that are interested in investing in the space, but they can't see any opportunity to invest in anything in the UK in the near term that's going to be large enough for them to get involved. So I think the amount of investor capital which is committed or is actively looking at the moment is somewhat understating the amount of capital that would be there if there were larger opportunities. So at the moment it tends to be smaller institutions, smaller investors, some high net worth individuals that would look at investment, but in reality there's a whole lot of other people that are keeping an eye on the sector, and as soon as there's something that's liquid enough, then they'll be very interested in investing.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to know what the panel thought about the restriction in terms of banking. Proceeds of crime seems to be something that banks are very wary of once you know, acquire their services in regards to a cannabis business. So how do you get around this particular factor when it's such a sensitive subject, even for media agencies such as Facebook, Instagram? You know, they don't want to associate advertising space or advertising platforms with cannabis businesses. So how do you see this changing? Because it is an essential part of investment, of course.
It is a huge problem, and in some ways that's why we set up CannaFi to provide debt finance, because if people can't get banking, they certainly can't get access to any loans. I don't think that it's going to change anytime soon, because from the bank's perspective, they don't see it as a big enough sector that's worth their while taking a risk. For most banks, they could bank most cannabis companies in the UK, but they're not going to, because from a risk perspective these days, it just falls in the too difficult to do bucket. I've had conversations with all of the major banks and most of the challenger banks, even where they are banking companies. They're taking them in the front door, and then they're actually, you talk to other people that are being thrown out after a period when they come up for a risk review. Unfortunately, at the moment, the only answer that's really available to the industry is some of the virtual providers, which are basically payments companies that will provide you with a virtual bank account, which is incredibly expensive, and they're going to charge per transaction. I think that will change over time. We'd certainly like to be able to try and come up with a solution if we can, but it's going to take some time because, again, in order to provide a virtual solution, you've got to actually have access to the banking system yourself to then be able to provide it. So I can't see anything changing in the near term, because from the bank's perspective, even where they want to get involved, and I know of quite a decent sized bank that really wanted to get involved, but the problem that they have is that the US banks that they deal with, because they're federally regulated, they say, well, fine, if you bank this industry, we're just going to cut you off from the dollar market. So it's not entirely the bank's fault. Certainly, if there's a change in federal regulation in the US, then it may mean that one or two banks can start to get involved. But from the big bank's perspective, I can't see it coming out of the too difficult to do bucket for some time.
I think I can endorse all of that. It's a very good question, by the way. It's something that we struggle with both in the UK and the US. I mean, interestingly, in the US, we bank with a European bank who is not perhaps subject to the same federal restrictions that some of the local competitors are. I think what the industry is crying out for is more certain regulation. Just as investors are asking us constantly, is your business legal? Well, the answer is yes, it is, and we provide legal opinions from UK and US attorneys to prove that. We get the same question from the banks and the financial services providers, and we can demonstrate very clearly that everything we're doing is well within the law. But in a new industry where people are doing different things, you're getting different opinions. I was joking with someone earlier that I could talk to 3 law firms in London and ask the same question, and I'll get 3 very different answers as to what can and can't be done within the hemp and CBD industry. Now, I think things are improving. I certainly agree with Geoff. I think we're some way off. But what we need is a harmonisation and a clear structure of regulations. And I think for most companies, and companies like us, we would really welcome a clear, defined regulatory environment that just creates a level playing field and creates certainty for everyone. And I think that will be the beginning of solving the problem with the banks and the financial services providers. It will also, I think, give some help to the stock exchange and investors as well. I'm often asked a question, if I invest money in your company, Nick, does that mean that I'm breaking the law? Well, the answer is no, you're not. But just the fact the question is coming, very few listed companies on the market would be asked that question. And so I think regulation is really what we're looking for.
Okay, anything else?
yeah, touching on what you said, but people often ask if I invest in your company, am I breaking the law? And the answer is no. You can trust that most companies, including us, we've taken all legislative and administrative precautions to ensure that we're fully compliant here in the UK, though we are operating overseas. And it's loose. It's basically, the uncertainty around legislation is the reason banks don't really, they see it as a grey area where, like you said, it's more aggravation than what it's worth, given that they don't know enough about, the precautions and what precautions to take when dealing with cannabis companies just yet. I think in time, as it becomes more normalised and there's more agreeance with it by the public, and people see it as public health as well and welfare. They will start to come on board with companies and feel a lot more comfortable doing so in the future, definitely.
Yeah, I'd really pick up on the point there on social media, because that's something that we have had experience of. We've got various different social platforms that are focused on our Cannabis Investor Forum, and we have had some success in running social adverts, paid for ads. It is a little bit hit and miss, but overdoing it the last sort of 6 months or so, really I think we're seeing a bit of a softening. It's really down to what you're putting in the ads. Obviously, different images are actually blocked out by various different platforms. However, using the word cannabis, we've done that on multiple occasions, and that's really getting quite a lot of traction across particularly Twitter. That's quite a successful one that we're seeing at this point in time. And really, I think if you're looking at the social media route of things at this point in time, as a lot of the businesses in here will be doing, I think it's really sort of creating your own content and building your own communities, as opposed to looking to run those ads, because we haven't had any major issues with any of our profiles. So I know that there are probably some people in here putting cannabis leaves on their ads that are getting taken down immediately, but I think if you go about it the right way, I think you're seeing a bit of a softening in the approach from social media companies.
Any other questions on that point? I think.
So everyone's in accordance that there isn't really a bank, or maybe there is, please correct me if I'm wrong, there isn't really a bank in the UK, at least on the high street, that can provide the cannabis business needs, right? And does that essentially mean that there is a gap in the market for a new bank to come on the high street, or maybe, as you said, a virtual bank that is specifically aimed at cannabis businesses? And if so, why is no one tackling it?
You're right. There is an opportunity. At the moment, I'm aware of 2 virtual providers that are in the space, but they are very expensive. I mean, it costs you thousands of pounds to set the account up, and then they'll charge you a lot per transaction. And if you want to speak to them, it's a premium phone line. You can't email them. You can't get access through a website. So they are in the business of making a lot of money. So there's certainly an opportunity for somebody to come in and provide something. The challenge is that business itself has got to have access to the banking system, and so it's that kind of getting through it. Certainly you won't be in the UK, you can't do something which is entirely focused on the cannabis industry. The way that the virtual providers are getting around it at the moment is that they're getting their banks comfortable by saying, we will only do X% of our business in this space, and then we'll have a whole bunch of other things. And the banks are saying, okay, fine, we'll turn a blind eye. So I think it's going to be difficult in the UK for somebody to provide a specific product. But as I said, we're looking at whether we can do something, hopefully early next year, that will provide a solution. But it won't be coming through a UK bank, because that's just not going to work. There are some banks elsewhere in the world that do work. In Switzerland, for example, the Swiss banks are happy to bank the sector. The problem there is that it's even more expensive. So if you're a large company, then you can get banked, and you can get banked through Switzerland, and it's no problem at all. But for 90% of the businesses here, it will be prohibitively expensive.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. Is this being blocked by the Bank of Central England Bank, or is it the IMF who's actually regulating it and putting these?
It's the banks themselves and their own perception of risk.
Okay, so it's the risk
analysis. So it's the perception. I mean, if you talk to the risk guys, they will say there is a risk that because we're doing business in the US, that we could lose the ability to do all of our trade in dollars if the federal regulator doesn't like what we're doing over in the UK and Europe. Now, that's a very theoretical risk, and certainly when it becomes legal, when medicinal cannabis becomes legal at a federal level, and there are, I think, 4 different draft legislation that's in Congress at the moment, and unfortunately, given how dysfunctional Congress is, inevitably for the Republicans it's going too far, for the Democrats it's not going far enough, and they're trying to resolve this at the moment. It would be nice to think that it could get sorted, because if it does, then you've got the opportunity to actually try and get the banks to get involved in the sector. But otherwise, from the risk guys' perspective, they'll just say, well, look, this is not something which the US federal regulators like. So from our perspective, we need to be able to do dollar business. We can't afford to upset them.
Okay,
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? No? Okay, just coming back to the regulation piece, and of course it's a landscape, it's a minefield sometimes. Is there any, what's a two-pronged attack, is there any governmental policy champion that wants to advance this agenda to not necessarily make it easier, but make it cleaner and quicker? And I think, as we said earlier, both Nick, you and Jonathan as well, you've alluded to, there are people you think they're just about to take the plunge and sort of follow suit, and I think then it will just provide this avalanche. Is there anyone from a policy-making standpoint in government or in the opposition that's advocating for a cleaner, quicker, of course, tighter regulation? We have some clarity. Is that happening, do you think, at governmental level?
It is. I've met with, I think, 3 backbench MPs from different parties who do have an interest in establishing a regulatory framework for this sector. But I think the emphasis is backbench, and also, given everything else that's going on in the political landscape, I think it would be probably overly optimistic of me to say this is something that's going to happen very, very soon. But I think there's definitely a move, and as the investment community gets more interested in the cannabis and hemp sector, I mean, if you look around the room today, you can see the scale of the industry here in the UK. It is far, far bigger in the US. We are beginning to see the building blocks of a regulatory and, I suppose, more certain framework. At the moment, I mentioned earlier, we deal in legal opinions. I carry around on my phone our US and our UK legal opinions, so I can demonstrate to anyone immediately that everything we're doing is perfectly legal. But this is abnormal. Most industries don't need to do that. In almost any other industry, whatever you're working in is just assumed and expected to be legal. But we're constantly challenged here in the hemp and CBD and cannabis industries, and this is a necessary length to go to. Now, we're quite fortunate. We are banked in the UK and we're banked in the US. We struggle a lot with payment providers and other financial services providers, but this is a struggle that, again, it's peculiar to the industry, and I think people are beginning to recognise that. I agree with Geoff. It would be a fallacy to say that this will all be sorted out next week or it will all be sorted out next month. But I think as bigger companies and more established businesses get involved in the space, and again, many of them are here today, I think we'll see that snowball beginning to gather speed as it comes down the mountain in order to build that regulatory framework that I think we're all crying out for.
Okay.
I mean, I know loosely, based off various news articles I've read, that we are working towards, more regulation, and I just want to say, I think the sooner the better, because that way we're driving less into organised crime, and really just, creating jobs, opportunities here at home, and ultimately bringing, tax revenues for the country, which I think are going to be very important post-Brexit. So.
Yeah, I think the question is not so much is it on a policy level, because we've seen the legalisation of medicinal cannabis last year. What the question is really the bodies beneath that are the facilitators of that, and where they are with it. And obviously looking at the UK Listing Authority here in London, they've got a number of files on their desk at this moment that they're working through, and it's really a case of them trying to implement that policy at the moment, which is really the struggle, as opposed to actually the policy being put in place.
Okay, one last question from me. I'll hand back to the panel to cover any last final topics. I think just to come back to your point earlier, Nick, and maybe Geoff, you can add to this, is talking about a number of small investors, volumes. What type of value amount in sterling in US are they investing? And again, I guess I'm saying on an average, comparable to the risk involved. And as you say, you're pretty careful with grey area. You're sort of discounting various legislations, various states in the US. Is it a case that you're just seeing is it high volume, small amounts? And then as we talked about, I think Geoff talked about earlier about family offices, that's a different animal, it's a different beast. What's the sort of level investment breakup? What does that look like?
We get quite a mix. We're very dominated by retail investors at Zoetic International. I suppose the advantage of us being listed is you can go onto the stock exchange website and you can see minute by minute or hour by hour the trades that go through, and you can very quickly multiply that by our share price to see the size of commitment people are making. Now we have a small number of institutions in the stock. They tend to be the smaller and perhaps more fleet of foot institutions rather than the very mainstream household names that you might see advertised in newspapers. And we have a number of, I suppose, relatively high net worth individuals who have participated in the stock as well, who own a meaningful stake, so more than 2% of the company, for example, on an individual basis. And then we have a large number of retail investors, some of whom would have very, very small stakes, or small stakes relative to the company, but possibly quite meaningful investments from their point of view. And I think that's what creates the liquidity in the stock. So we are getting a very good range of different investors coming through. I suppose what is interesting to me, or what's important to me, is constantly filling the hopper at the other end and constantly building that investor fan club. A lot of people want to meet us 2 or 3 times. They'll want to see some results. They'll want to see that we're capable of making money. It's one thing to be involved in a very exciting industry, but if you're an investor, none of it counts unless you're making money. And as I said at the start, we demonstrate that by producing good quality products that are well branded. Social media was a good point that was made earlier by Jonathan. We spend a lot of time building our social media presence. A lot of mainstream advertising media will not accept CBD or not accept hemp. So we spend a lot of time on Twitter and on Instagram. And certainly when we're talking to prospective retailers and wholesalers, the 2 most common questions I get asked are, what's your social media following and what's your packaging like? The actual quality of the product, which is so important to us, so often comes into 3rd place. So it's very much about building that capability to demonstrate we can fulfill orders, we can provide a good quality, a good consistent product, and against that we're getting investors from a very wide range of backgrounds investing a very disparate amount of money into the company, and that's what creates the liquidity. So from our point of view, that's terrific.
Okay, anyone else? Any questions? Final questions from anyone? Okay, I'd like to thank Geoff, Nick, Zavio and Jonathan for their time, their insight, their wisdom. You are floating around for the rest of the day, I'm sure. People will come and grab you, so please do seek some more counsel, go off and have some one-to-one meetings. But thank you so much.